In recent news, Oprah Winfrey's name has surfaced again, whispers saying she might be next after Diddy. People point to how certain guests were handled on her show, how some left smaller than they arrived. I won't argue the claims. I'll only say this. I was there. I worked inside the Chicago studio. I watched the warmth shift, the air thin, the room choose who it fed. This is not an exposé, it's a memory. And once you hear it, you won't look at her the same. I kept notes because something was wrong. The day she finally spoke to me alone, I understood the cost and why it always seemed heavier on people who looked like they came from the same place she did. I grew up in Chicago believing Oprah was proof that something good could come from here and still belong to everyone. My mother used to keep the television on low while she cooked, the blue glow filling the kitchen like a second window. When Oprah spoke, the room shifted, not dramatically, just enough that you leaned in. My aunts talked about her like she was a relative who made it out and came back wiser. Someone who knew how the world worked and wanted to teach you how to survive it. So when I got the job at the studio, it didn't feel like employment. It felt like selection. The building itself was quieter than I expected. Not peaceful, controlled. Even the hallways seemed trained to swallow sound. People spoke softly without being asked to. Doors closed without slamming. Laughter never lingered too long. It was the kind of place where you learned the rules by watching what didn't happen. On my first day, my badge felt too stiff against my chest. I kept checking it, half expecting someone to stop me and say there had been a mistake, but no one did. They smiled, nodded, told me where to stand, when to speak, when not to. Oprah wasn't there that day, but her presence was. You could feel it in the way people straightened when her name came up, in the way conversations recalibrated themselves mid-sentence. She didn't need to enter a room to change it. The idea of her was enough. At first, I thought the tightness I felt was excitement. Pressure meant importance, right? That's what I told myself when I noticed how carefully people measured their words. When someone paused too long before answering a question, then laughed it off like it was nothing. When a producer quietly redirected a guest and said, "Let's tighten that," in a tone that sounded helpful but final. I told myself this was excellence. The guests were the part I loved most. Watching people walk in with their shoulders high, eyes bright, hands shaking just a little. Some of them had waited their whole lives to be there. You could see it in how carefully they sat, how earnestly they spoke. Being heard here meant something. It meant legitimacy. And for some guests, that feeling only grew. They were met with warmth that seemed to expand the room. Oprah listened to them the way people listen when they already agree. She let their stories breathe, laughed easily, touched their hands, leaned in, made them feel like time was flexible for them. Those guests left glowing. Others left quieter. I didn't notice it all at once. It was more like a pattern you feel before you understand. A tension in the air that didn't lift after the cameras stopped rolling. Some guests would thank everyone politely, but their smiles were tight, eyes unfocused, like they were replaying something in their heads and couldn't quite name it. I heard phrases repeated often. "That was good for you. She was just trying to help." It's a learning moment. No one ever said anything was wrong, and that was the strangest part. Oprah herself was exactly as she appeared on screen. Calm, centered, never rushed, never cruel. When she corrected someone, it sounded like guidance. When she interrupted, it felt intentional, not impatient. She had a way of making disappointment sound like care. I admired that. I still do, in a way. But there were moments, small ones, when I felt something shift in my body when she entered a space. Like the room was being measured, not just watched. Like something was deciding what it could take and what it would leave behind. I ignored that feeling for a long time. I told myself I was lucky. That being near power always felt strange at first. That reverence and fear were easy to confuse. After all, I was where I had dreamed of being. I was inside the building I grew up watching from across the room, and nothing bad had happened yet. I didn't know then that the horror of that place wasn't loud. It didn't announce itself. It waited. The rules had stopped feeling new and started feeling unspoken. No one ever handed you a manual explaining how people were treated differently. You learned it the way you learn the mood of a room after an argument, by noticing what changes when certain people speak, when certain names appear on the schedule, when certain guests are escorted down the hallway with an extra layer of attention that looks like kindness from a distance. Some guests were given room. You could feel it the moment they sat down. The energy softened, time stretched. Oprah leaned in, asked follow-up questions, laughed easily. If they stumbled, she waited. If they went long, no one cut them off. Producers didn't signal. Cameras lingered. Those conversations breathed. Other guests were treated with the same calm tone, but not the same patience. Their words were gently redirected. Their stories were tightened. Oprah's smile stayed in place, but it sharpened, not visibly. Just enough that you felt it rather than saw it. When those guests hesitated, she didn't wait. When they explained themselves, she summarized. When they grew emotional, she steadied the room by bringing it back to herself. No one raised their voice. No one was insulted. And yet something was being corrected. I watched guests walk in with their shoulders squared, speaking quickly from nerves, excitement buzzing through them like electricity. You could tell who had rehearsed in the mirror, who had prayed before arriving, who believed this moment would change something. Some of them left glowing. Others left smaller. I began to notice the exits more than the entrances. How people's footsteps slowed once the cameras stopped. How they thanked everyone too many times. How they avoided eye contact with staff as if embarrassed by something they couldn't quite name. Sometimes they were quiet. Sometimes they were furious, but controlled. Sometimes they laughed too loudly, like they were trying to convince themselves the experience had been good for them. I heard the same phrases repeated again and again. That was good for you. She was just trying to help. It's a learning moment. Those phrases acted like seals. Once spoken, the conversation ended. No one ever said the wrong thing happened. No one ever framed it as harm. Everything was professional. Everything was clean. That made it impossible to push back without sounding emotional. Or worse, ungrateful. I started noticing how staff adjusted their behavior, depending on the guest, where they stood, when they spoke, who they warned ahead of time. There were guests who were given reassurance before going on set, gentle reminders, smiles that said, "You're safe here." There were others who were given silence, not hostility, not cruelty, just an absence of softness, as if warmth were a limited resource and had already been allocated elsewhere. Oprah didn't need to explain herself. Her authority filled in the gaps. When she spoke, the room aligned itself around her. Not out of fear, out of instinct, like plants turning toward light. And I began to understand something unsettling. She didn't react to people the same way. She listened differently, measured differently. Some guests were met with curiosity. Others were met with evaluation. It was subtle enough that you could convince yourself it was about experience, about preparation, about professionalism. That's what I told myself for a long time. But patterns don't need intention to exist. There were days when Oprah wasn't scheduled to be in the building until late, and yet the energy shifted hours before her arrival. Voices lowered, jokes disappeared. Everyone became sharper, tighter, more careful. It was like the room anticipated her. Guests felt it too. I saw them stiffen as airtime approached, fidgeting with their clothes, asking the same questions twice. Others looked relaxed, almost protected, as if they knew the room would receive them kindly. I couldn't explain why. I just knew that some people seemed to walk into her presence already bracing for impact, while others didn't. And what unsettled me most was that Oprah never appeared to notice the difference. Or maybe she noticed it perfectly. By the end of my third year, I stopped telling myself it was all in my head. I didn't have language for it yet. I didn't have proof, but I had a feeling that wouldn't leave, a sense that the room wasn't neutral and never had been. It was choosing. And the longer I stayed, the more I realized that if you were chosen the wrong way, the damage didn't happen on camera. It happened afterward, in the silence. By my third year at the studio, I stopped telling myself I was imagining it. Patterns have a way of losing their subtlety once you've lived inside them long enough. What once felt like isolated moments began lining up with unsettling precision. I could predict how a day would feel just by glancing at the schedule. Certain names brought a tightening to the room before anyone said a word. Others brought relief so obvious it felt inappropriate. The guests who shared Oprah's background arrived with a particular energy, something between reverence and urgency. They were excited, yes, but also desperate to be understood. You could see it in how quickly they spoke, how much they tried to compress their life into a few perfect sentences. They laughed loudly, nodded often, leaned forward like proximity might earn them grace. Those were the guests who changed the most. Oprah's tone with them was never cruel. That's important. It was firm, precise, corrective. She listened, but not indulgently. She interrupted sooner, redirected faster. Praise, when it came, was measured, almost instructional. Conversations that began with hope slowly turned inward, focused on responsibility, discipline, and self-improvement. The room felt tighter during those segments, not hostile, just stripped of softness. Time shortened. Cameras pulled back sooner. When the taping ended, those guests often sat still for a moment, blinking like they had stepped out of harsh light. They rarely smiled on the way out. By contrast, other guests, especially the older ones, were treated with a patience that felt almost luxurious. Oprah leaned back with them, let their stories wander. Mistakes were brushed aside with humor. If they contradicted themselves, she laughed it off. The room relaxed. Staff breathed easier. These conversations felt safe, even celebratory. Those guests left lighter. The contrast was no longer deniable. What unsettled me most was how consistent it became. Staff began adjusting their behavior without being told. Producers prepped differently. Some guests were given extra reassurance before going on set, gentle reminders, affirming smiles. Others were met with efficiency and silence, no hostility, just a noticeable lack of warmth. I started hearing it in the whispers. She's going to be hard on them today. Make sure they're ready. Let's keep this tight. No one explained why, no one needed to. Oprah didn't have to announce expectations. Her presence alone recalibrated the room. And over time, I noticed something that made my stomach sink. She seemed hardest on the people who reminded her of where she came from. Not with anger, with standards. It felt like familiarity invited judgment, like recognition came with conditions. The closer someone appeared to her origin, the more they were expected to prove they had transcended it. I watched guests walk in believing they had finally reached someone who would understand them, only to leave feeling exposed, measured, and quietly reduced. Their excitement curdled into frustration. Their gratitude turned brittle. They didn't say it out loud. They couldn't. Everything had been polite, professional. On paper, nothing was wrong. But something had been taken. There were days when Oprah wasn't scheduled to arrive until late afternoon, and yet the studio changed hours beforehand. Voices dropped. Jokes disappeared. People became careful with their bodies, how they stood, how they laughed, how much space they took up. It was like the building anticipated her judgment. Guests felt it too. I saw them fidget with their clothes, ask the same questions twice, rehearse answers under their breath. Others sat calmly, almost protected, as if they already knew how the room would receive them. By then, I understood why. Fear here wasn't about being yelled at. It was about being corrected in a way that stayed with you, about being reshaped under the guise of guidance, about realizing that warmth was not evenly distributed and never had been. The worst part was that Oprah never appeared to notice the imbalance, or maybe she noticed it perfectly. By the end of that year, I started keeping quiet notes, not accusations, observations, names, reactions, how people entered, how they left. I didn't have proof. I didn't have language, but I knew the room wasn't neutral. It was measuring resemblance and deciding who needed to be made smaller. The meeting was scheduled for 7 minutes. That's what the assistant told me, eyes already moving past me as if the time had been spent just by being acknowledged. 7 minutes felt generous, important. It also felt like a warning. Oprah's office was warmer than the rest of the building, but not comforting. The light came from low lamps instead of overhead fixtures, giving everything a soft, flattering glow. It was the kind of room designed to make you feel chosen, just for being allowed inside it. She stood when I entered, smiled, gestured for me to sit. That smile did not reach her eyes. She didn't ask how I was. She didn't need to. She began speaking as if we were already mid-conversation, as if the important parts had happened long before I walked through the door. "You're very good at what you do," she said calmly, not warmly, precisely. "That's why you're here." I nodded, thanked her. My voice sounded smaller than I expected. She studied me for a moment, not my face exactly, but something behind it, like she was looking for a version of me I hadn't chosen yet. "You have to understand something," she continued. "This space doesn't exist for feelings, it exists for function." I felt my stomach tighten. She spoke about opportunity the way other people speak about currency, something finite, something easily wasted. She mentioned men I recognized immediately, not by name but by type. Successful, charismatic, talented, men who had come through this building believing their presence meant validation. "They forget what they're here for," she said. "They start thinking this is about them." Her voice didn't harden, it thinned. "We are representations," she said. "That's the job. That's always been the job. We reflect something larger than ourselves. And when you're given access to a platform like this, you don't get to confuse purpose with personal comfort." I felt heat rise in my face. She leaned forward slightly, not aggressively, but enough to remind me of the imbalance between us. "I don't need to like you," she said. "I need you to perform." The word perform landed heavier than anything else she'd said. She spoke about discipline, about responsibility, about how easily people from where we come from let emotion interfere with excellence. She didn't raise her voice. She didn't insult me. She framed everything as guidance. "You don't get this far by being sensitive," she said. "You get here by being useful." I realized then that she was not speaking to me. She was speaking to something she saw in me, something familiar, something she seemed determined to correct. She talked about how many chances people are given before they ruin them, about how the audience doesn't care how you feel, only how you perform, about how opportunity is not an invitation to be seen fully, but a test to see if you can maintain control. "People are watching," she said softly, "and they are not watching for your truth. They're watching for reassurance." Her gaze never wavered. I wanted to interrupt, to ask a question, to clarify, but the room felt airless. She ended the meeting by standing again, signaling finality without dismissal. "You're capable," she said, "but capability has to be managed." I stood, thanked her. My hands were shaking, though I didn't know when that had started. As I walked out, I realized something terrifying. She hadn't threatened me. She hadn't needed to. She had simply explained the cost. And what unsettled me most, what still keeps me awake, was not what she said about the job. It was how clearly she seemed to know what I would be willing to sacrifice to keep it. By the time I reached the hallway, the warmth was gone. The building felt hollow again. And I understood then that the fear wasn't about losing my position. It was about how easily I had almost agreed to disappear inside it. I stayed for another year after that meeting. That surprised me at first. I thought the fear would drive me out immediately. That once I understood the system clearly, I wouldn't be able to participate in it anymore. But fear doesn't always push you away. Sometimes it teaches you how to survive inside the thing that scares you. I became smaller without anyone asking me to. I spoke less in meetings. I chose my words more carefully. I learned when to disappear into the background and when to be visible just enough to be useful. I stopped volunteering opinions. I stopped correcting things that felt wrong but were framed as necessary. Nothing bad happened after that. That was the most unsettling part. Oprah didn't punish me. She didn't watch me more closely. She didn't single me out. She simply let the system do what it was designed to do. And once you understood the rules, it was easy to stay safe. You just had to give up the parts of yourself that made you recognizable. I watched new guests come through the studio, and I could predict the outcome almost perfectly. I could tell who would be indulged and who would be refined, who would be affirmed quiet, and who would be corrected loud. I could see the hope in their faces when they arrived, and the calculation when they left. Some of them asked me afterward, in low voices, if they had done something wrong. I always told them no, because on paper they hadn't. Everything had been polite, professional, encouraging. The footage looked clean. The audience applauded at the right moments. The narrative held, but I knew what had happened. I knew because I could feel it in my own body. Every day, I walked into that building. A low-level tension that never resolved. A constant awareness of how much space I was allowed to take up and how quickly it could be reduced. Over time, I realized Oprah didn't need to be harsh to be effective. She didn't tear people down. She reshaped them, and she was most precise with the ones who mirrored her too closely, the ones who came in hoping for recognition, the ones who believed proximity meant protection. That was the lie. Proximity meant expectation. Expectation meant correction. Correction meant subtraction. By the end, I understood why no one ever said it out loud. Naming it would mean admitting how well it worked. I left quietly. No exit interview, no announcement. I told people I was ready for the next chapter, that it was time to grow. Everyone smiled and nodded, the way they always did. On my last day, I stood in the hallway longer than I needed to. The building felt the same as it always had. Controlled, quiet, efficient. It didn't mourn me. It didn't notice. As I walked out, I caught my reflection in the glass doors. I looked composed, professional, smaller. That's when it hit me. The horror of that place was never what it did to people publicly. It was what it taught them to do to themselves, how to edit their instincts, how to ration their emotions, how to survive by becoming palatable. Oprah wasn't a monster. She didn't need to be. She was something more enduring, a system that understood exactly how much of you to take, especially if you reminded it of where it came from. And the reason it works so well is simple. Most people don't leave because they're afraid of losing the opportunity. They leave because one day they realize they already lost something else, and no one ever told them when it happened. I didn't tell this story for attention. I told it because silence is how systems survive. If you've seen this pattern before, leave a comment. If stories like this matter to you, subscribe. Some rooms only stay quiet because no one speaks after leaving them.